Hello and welcome everyone. We're going to give this just a minute or two here before we get started as the attendees are coming in since we just opened the virtual doors. Thanks for being here tonight. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. Okay, the flow of folks coming in the door has slowed a bit, so I am going to go ahead and get us started here. Right, so welcome. Welcome everyone to the New Directions in Public Gardens speaker series. As we get started, we do want to take a moment here. Let me advance my slide. I'm going to take a moment to reflect on the land on which we live and work here in the Seattle area. We acknowledge and honor the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. The University of Washington Botanic Gardens is your host this evening. Our mission is sustaining managed and natural ecosystems and the human spirit through plant research, education, and display. Our spaces include the Washington Park Arboretum and the Center for Urban Horticulture in Seattle, Washington, including the Union Bay Natural Area, the Elizabeth C. Miller Library, and the UW Student Farm. And we offer education and conservation programs that serve our entire region. And tonight is the second session in our 2022 speaker series, New Directions in Public Gardens. And this is a series of conversations exploring how gardens like ours can evolve to meet community needs today and in the future. We acknowledge and see the colonial history of plant collections and the implicit and explicit exclusion of BIPOC communities from green spaces like public gardens as injustices that shape our past and present and must be countered as we move into the future. We're excited to dig into these conversations to learn more about community-led efforts in our region. And tonight's session will focus on efforts supporting the regeneration of Indigenous communities. Future sessions will explore environmental justice and job training programs, our local urban food systems, and the people of color-led community land conservancy that is acquiring land for parks in historically underserved communities. We want to make connections and highlight the work of these organizations and also explore how public gardens can engage with and support these efforts. I also want to express our gratitude to our partners at the Arboretum Foundation for their support in the development of this series. My name is Jessica Farmer. My pronouns are she, her, and I supervise the adult education programs at UW Botanic Gardens. And just a few other notes here as we get started. We will be keeping all the attendees' microphones and cameras off and using the Zoom tools for discussion today. We've enabled the auto transcription for closed captioning, so you can click on the CC tool at the bottom of your screen and choose to show or hide the subtitles. You should also see the Q&A and the chat tools at the bottom of your screen. We'll use Q&A for questions for our speakers, and you can submit questions at any time, and we'll have ample time for having conversation and answering questions later on. You can also use that if you have any technical assistance questions or need anything from me. Feel free to drop that in the Q&A. And then we've got the chat open as a place for community conversation, kudos, and a place for you to record your thoughts. We just ask that everyone keep it respectful in the chat and choose to use these conversations as an opportunity to move toward healing and creating action. Additional community agreements, we want to ask folks to find comfort in discomfort. It is normal to feel discomfort while exploring racial and social inequity. And while learning and discussion may not get any easier, your ability to engage in more meaningful conversations will expand. So please be courageous, be courteous, and stay engaged. We ask everyone to practice mindful listening and try to avoid planning what you're going to say as you listen to others. Listen with your whole self and expect and accept non closure. There is no quick fix. And so the more we discuss, the more we learn. The more we learn, the more appropriate and promising our actions and interventions will be. We are recording today's class. Tomorrow we'll send out an email, or today's discussion, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording to everyone who registered to attend. And we'll also be posting the recording to the speaker series website. Okay, so with that, I'm going to invite Maylin Plummer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Welcome, Maylin. Maylin is the director of the Idea Center for Public Gardens and is going to share a little bit more about what we're doing here with this series and the purpose of the Idea Center. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And also thank you so much, Christina and Wendy, for inviting me as part of this series. I had the great privilege of partnering and collaborating with you, to really develop something that I think is really impactful, but just also really full of intention around action. So yeah, I had the great privilege of the first lecture, and it's just such an honor and such a pleasure to be here also with Susan Balbas, and I can't wait to listen to all that she has to share and just to learn more. I think I'm also here, just initially here, just to help us all settle in and of course talk about our intent with this series, which, to just say it, it's very similar to what we're doing at the Idea Center. And a lot of this work, we have similar goals and similar intents. And so I think this in a wonderful way is just showing how we are acting and behaving in unity around this cause. And I think that that's just a wonderful thing. So I think some of you are probably coming in hot from a busy day. It's hectic, it's crazy out there. Some of you might be just kind of coasting and sailing in. I kind of imagining you all on different kinds of boats, some on sailboats, some coming on a speedboat, kind of sideswipe yourself into the dock and just be here. Take a deep breath and just give yourself a permission to just be here and get to spend the next, hour with this group of incredible people. In this work, we talk a lot about creating space for safety and conversation. But I want to add that in choosing to be here, each one of you, we are creating a space of intention to be here and to continue onward as change agents. So in that, I want to add that this is a celebration. So we celebrate you and thank you for being here. One of the things that I like to do in any kind of large group setting, or just whether it's in person or virtual, but just any gathering or group of people, I like to take a moment as I enter that space and really kind of, bring myself up 30,000 feet and look and just reflect and just see that, or experience that I am in a room or a space of where I'm more aware of each person that's in this space, and that we're all here with good intentions. We have differences in why we're here and how we learn, our comfort zones, how we approach change. We are a mosaic of truths, experiences, circumstances, opinions, abilities, ways of understanding, and I think profoundly a mosaic of identities. And that is something to really celebrate, right? So I think also that this series creates a space of opportunity and possibilities, seeds of intention that cultivate the world we want to create. So as I was saying earlier, I think that our reasons for being here and our intentions are generally shared. And so I thought I would go ahead and just kind of put us in this kind of space to be really thinking about this and putting intentionality around it. So I think number one, first and foremost, we're here for impact. We want change, preferably in our lifetimes. But I also recognize that this is also the work of many gardeners and cultivators, that we are creating the world that sometimes that we will never see, right? The garden we won't see, but that means that this is so important that we are cultivating these seeds of change. So, and ways of serving our communities in ways we haven't before. And that's just something that's really exciting in this impact, right? We're also here for enriched learning that deepens our awareness, builds knowledge, and gives us language to form authentic connections, and hopefully displace some of our assumptions and biases. Comfort with discomfort. And this is going to come up a lot, but it's becoming more self-aware of when we're in those moments of discomfort, and that we go and seek out where that edge is, right, of that comfort and our learning. And that ultimately perhaps shifts our discomfort into playful curiosity and the possibility of celebrating our differences and distinctions instead of disparaging them. Connection. We are here as a community of shared interests, shared experiences, and stories that we hope that will ripple out beyond, much farther beyond where we are right now. And lastly, I've come to this kind of really today, we're in really tumultuous times. And it's just furthered my sense of resolve. And I think many of you can relate to that. And that resolve, in my mind, takes allyship to another level. Allyship is so incredibly important, but we have to back that up with action and intention. And so that's where my resolve is, to continue doing this work so that we can actually experience the world and create the world we want to create. So with that, let's begin.
Thank you. And welcome Wendy Gibble, Associate Director of the UW Botanic Gardens, to introduce our featured speaker tonight.
Thanks, Jessica. It is truly my pleasure and privilege to introduce Susan Balbas. Susan is the co-founder and executive director of the Naha Ilahi Fund, and she is Cherokee and Yaqui. She carries valuable expertise at all levels of nonprofit or operations and management, and she was a national training and technical assistance specialist for multiple tribal youth programs for the U.S. Department of Justice's Tribal Youth Programs through the Education Development Center. Susan has been an independent consultant working with tribes, artists, and nonprofit organizations, and she has held positions as the Chief Development Officer at the United Indians of All Tribes Foundation in Seattle, and Outreach Director at the Western Water Alliance in Seattle, where she was the primary researcher on water and related environmental issues. So we welcome Susan and look forward to hearing about her work with the Naha Ilahi Fund. And this is a nonprofit that works, an Indigenous women-led organization dedicated to the ongoing regeneration of Indigenous communities. And I have to say, I had the pleasure of meeting Susan a number of years ago and just was immediately impressed with the tremendous work that you and your organization are doing. So it's just a real pleasure to have you here this evening. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Gosh, make me feel so special. And thank you, Maylin, for those beautiful words, and Jessica. It's really an honor to be here tonight with this series. It's really incredible. And I see a lot of the speakers are my friends that I've worked a lot with over the years. So that's super exciting to see as well. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about Na'a Ilahi Fund. Na'a is mother and Ilahi is land or earth in the Chinook Wawa language. That language is a trade language of the Greater Pacific Northwest region. And since we serve the greater Pacific Northwest region, it always seems most appropriate. We try to use our indigenous languages as much as we can because they're at risk. Especially during COVID, we lost a lot more fluid speakers. And so, yeah, we try to use our languages as much as we can. So that means Mother Earth. And that is where we focus. We began Na'a'ilahi. It was late 2004. I can't believe it's really been that long, but it has. And as a response to kind of what we're doing here in the field of philanthropy, I got a job at a foundation after I left the NEA Youth and Family Center in Portland, where I was in graduate school at Portland State and was at NEA Youth and Family Center for 4 years, getting it set up to become the amazingly just multi-dimensional organization that it is today. So I'm really proud of that. But my work in philanthropy, what I found was that there just was so, you could count Native Americans on one hand in philanthropy in the late 90s and early 2000s when I was working at a foundation in San Francisco. And so I came back up and helped, really helped to launch the Potlatch Fund. But the Potlatch Fund was not focused on Indigenous women or environmental issues. And so that is when we launched the Na'a'ilahi Fund. And we are still sister organizations with Potlatch Fund. And so we focus primarily on grant making. We're a public fund, so we raise funds to get funds out. And we are an example and take leadership within the realm of Indigenous-led philanthropy. And what that means, that's an international concept, and we work with a lot of international funds. And what we found with our Indigenous-led funds is that what that translates into is connection in community, not just merely a grant maker. Because what we know is that, as Wendy mentioned, our mission is to really advance the regeneration of Indigenous sustainable economies and work and community development, and that takes more than money. And so we are an intersectional, intergenerational organization that works directly in community. And that's how I have met lots of the colleagues who you're going to hear from in this series through our land-based work. And that's how I met Wendy, because one of the key issues for Indigenous people who live in urban areas, which is the majority of Native people today, is access. The majority of folks are still low income. So we have transportation barriers. We have people have been cut off, sometimes from their homelands, from their families, from their cultural traditions. And so in the city, we try to do the best that we can to be that bridge and locate resources for Native people and help them to build community here and build leadership. And so some of the work that we do, I'll talk about grant making first. We have several grant pools opportunities throughout the year. The first one is food sovereignty, food security, and food sovereignty. And we get out about $300,000 or $400,000 a year, and we could give a lot more. We get many, many applications, and it just warms my heart to read these incredible applications and proposals for community projects across the state of Washington, and also in the greater Northwest region. So we also fund communities in Oregon, Idaho, Montana and Wyoming, British Columbia, and Alaska. And as you can imagine, they're all very different contexts for the work. And so it's really enriching for us just to be that bridge and get those resources, especially out to isolated areas where they don't have access to a lot of financial resources. And so we're really honored to do this work. So we start the year with food sovereignty to make sure those gardeners can get that funding in early so they can get their seeds in the ground and get going. And then we move into this year, we're doing the rights of nature, where we have selected 5 tribes that are going to work with our partner movement rights, and they will be developing tribal codes around bringing the rights of nature into legal code. And this is a movement that's happening internationally and quite a few tribes here in the US, and it's a movement that we are helping to fuel. And we're very honored to be able to do that work. When you really can bridge treaty rights with the rights of nature, it can be a very powerful tool for protecting Mother Earth and protecting our relatives and protecting the lands and the waters that we all need to survive. We have a youth grant making committee who've decided upon this year to do a scholarship. So they are giving scholarships out to young people in college, community college, tribal colleges, university settings. And so it's really great to see the young people, their teenagers and young adults managing this grant pool. So that's pretty exciting. And then we have our 2-year grant, which is green infrastructure capacity building. So we give 2-year grants around building green infrastructure in tribal communities. And that just comes in a myriad of really exciting ways. Kelp farming, recycling programs, all kinds of very, very amazing, innovative projects. Another area that we work in is around the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people. We have every fall we launch that and help domestic violence, sexual assault, and missing and murdered, because they're all interconnected. So we help mostly like grassroots programs. And we also have our Red Blanket Fund, which gives rapid response to the families of the missing and the murdered. And that's growing as well. There was one other fund in Montana, and now one has popped up in Oregon. So we're hoping to grow that as well. So that's our grant making. So really what we do is look at really build capacity in different ways. So we also have our leadership society, where we have our Sovereign Futures cohort, where we select 10 to 20 cohort members every year, and they go into a process. They meet weekly, bi-weekly, and they meet as a group. They have amazing speakers, Indigenous knowledge keepers within the areas of regenerative economy, just transitions, environmental policy work, and then we go into their projects and help them to develop community-led projects around regenerative economies. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of that work is tied to the land. And so we help to support leaders, develop leaders with skills and knowledge and skill sharing amongst themselves. And then we also develop our land conservancy, the Eliptilicum, right alongside Sean Watts and Paulina, and the communities of color and we are partnering with that to kind of learn together to launch this. So we will launch the first Indigenous-led and Indigenous lands land conservancy, the Eliptilicum, which is the people's land, is the name, and that is also a Shinnewawa term. So that's some of the work that we do at Na'ilahi. We do a lot of other things too, events, community workshops. We are working out at Discovery Park, and when we're talking about public lands now, we started working at the Arboretum space, accessing their amazing raised beds, doing gardening there with community, for community, doing learning, planting sacred seeds that have been donated to us from around the country, around the world even. That's been very, very special. And we started working out at Discovery Park on the Daybreak Star lands. They have 20 acres, I believe, right on the edge of the park. And we've been working on that land for about 6 years now in partnership with the Green Seattle Partnership and Daybreak Star and Seattle Parks and Rec. And we're starting a Indigenous Council to help the park come up with policies that embrace and support their Indigenous citizens. We also have a youth trails cohort where we bring in teenagers that work with the Parks Department to work on the trails, and they're learning skills, hands in the dirt, awesome skills out on the land. And yeah, so that's some of the things we do. So in terms of urban people, like we do funding across the region with lots of different, very diverse Native communities across the region. But all of our hands in the dirt land work is located right in the Seattle area, Seattle, King County, a little bit down into Thurston, you know, right around the Puget Sound area, Salish Sea area. And that is our land-based work because that's where our staff lives. And so we really interact with the urban Native communities who sometimes are many generations in the city now because of federal Indian policy beginning in the mid 20th century, which relocated Native people to cities to learn technical skills. And so now we have several families that have been in the city for, I think, 3 and 4 generations now, actually. And also folks that have moved here like myself with family, for opportunity, for school, work, all kinds of reasons that people relocate to the area. And because access is one of the biggest issues for urban folks. And so it's actually an issue for reservation folks too. We talk about, we talk with our networks quite a bit, and some of the issues that have come up is where there's traditional gathering places that are now owned by non-Native people. And so that has been a big issue as well. But in terms of public lands, what this series is about, we like take it where we can get it. Like, we are resourceful people, right? And because we are taxpayers and we live and work here, we want to claim access to some of the public lands. And I've been involved in the King County Open Space Equity Cabinet, where we were helping to make some changes in the Conservation Futures Tax, not the tax, the fund. And I've worked with the City of Seattle in their Equitable Development Initiative and their strategic investment funds, just helping to bring access and green space to Native families and to all families and people. And so that's some of the work that we do. I wanted to touch a little bit on challenges since we are having these kinds of conversations. Some of the challenges that we run into are, number one, public policy. a lot of times the public policies are not designed for Native people in mind. There was at one point, I had to get very firm with the parks, and I said, if you spray pesticides, you are poisoning your citizens, because this is where we gather our medicinal plants. And they said, well, it's illegal to gather medicinal plants. And we said, well, that's what we have access to, and we're not going to stop. And so we've been gathering here for a long, long time. And so this has sparked a lot of movement in the Parks Department, and then they said, well, do you want us to change that policy and open it up? And we said, no, because then we'll have all of the folks that are liking to gather native plants in the parks gathering, and there goes our traditional places, and that's where we have access. And so that's one of the challenges, our policy, and we're working on those. I would say just misunderstandings of the general population, the larger community, about what we're doing. We've been confronted while in the parks and gathering our traditional medicines and plants and food plants. And we just sing songs and are positive and say, this is what we do, and try to bring them in and explain a little bit, but that's how we practice our ways, right? Is in and we do that with the children, with the youth, and yeah, so those are some of the challenges, I think. Policy, misunderstanding of the community, in the gardens sometimes, the volunteers that are there that have been there for a long time don't understand and might see us as outsiders, and that's been an issue as well. So I think it just takes education, right? It just takes more of it. It takes us to be present, to be open and loving with each other. And with that, I'm going to end and take questions and maybe have some discussion here.
Thank you so much, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to invite back everybody else to come on camera too. We also have with us today Christina Owen, who's the director of UW Botanic Gardens. And we just want to have a conversation now about all the great efforts that you've just shared with us, and ways that public gardens, organizations like ours, can play a role. It can help support those efforts. And it doesn't have to just be our garden specifically, but others who are kind of in this role of having responsibility for stewarding land and having impacts on things like access to culturally important resources. So with that, I'd also invite the audience to send in any questions that you have, and if anybody has something prepared they want to kick us off with, go right ahead.
Well, I'll start. And Susan, knowing a little bit about the program that you were pursuing in the Arboretum, I'm really curious about the transition that I feel like there's been a transition in your priorities in the lot since I've known you, toward more grant making and perhaps stepping back a little bit from on the ground. So I wanted to understand that a little bit more and understand why you made that transition and how we can support that that work better.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. We did, and I'll tell you what really kind of made the shift for us was COVID. The coronavirus. Just at the outbreak, we were kind of like everybody else, like, what is this going to look like? Like, what do we need to do? And we knew it was going to disproportionately impact Native communities because the infrastructure isn't there that allowed people to kind of weather this pandemic better. We're not there. And so we knew. So we had to have all hands on deck. We took all of our staff. We worked day and night on COVID response, getting out to our communities and saying, what is going on? What do you need us to do? So the first one was, of course, food security. So we developed our indigenous food boxes, we called them, food bundles. And we shopped, and so we kind of like, we shopped with indigenous producers. So we had native farmers, fisher people, hunters, all kinds of different products that we could find to support small business, who also businesses went flat during the pandemic. So we supported them at the same time. We were getting desperately needed supplies out to community across the state. We delivered, I think it got to 1,500 indigenous food bundles across the state for several months. And we employed people to help, you know, we hired folks to deliver, to put bundles together. And so that was a huge effort for our staff, and that went on for about 6-8 months, I believe. And then when we began to look at, I talked about that disproportionate impact was very deep and very hard for a lot of Native families. And so we began to look at food security more broadly and more, you know, in a sustainability model. Like, so we began to build gardens. So we built gardens out at Skokomish, up at Tulalip. We were going to build one at the women's shelter, several places. I think we built 4 gardens last summer, big one, community gardens. And we also did like container gardens for families who lived in apartments and didn't have any access to land to grow. And so then we raised a lot of money. Thank you, Seattle Foundation, all in Washington. Thank you to the philanthropic sector, who's been going through a transformation as well, looking at like, what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong and how can we do better? So the pandemic, I think, has really helped there. So we've raised a lot of money, and we were able now to focus on looking at the systemic issues in Native communities and moving a little bit away from hands-on learning and more funding that, and doing a lot more fiscal sponsorships to help grassroots groups get started in their own gardens. And so that's been the shift, Wendy, is doing more funding, getting more resources out, and connecting people with resources and with each other so that they can learn together, and doing more cohorts and leadership development. Thank you for asking that question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been a really, I've really admired the many grant making opportunities that you've been able to do. And it just seems like that's a very effective way to really expand your reach and enable Indigenous people to, you know, to learn and grow as they need to support themselves.
Yeah. And, you know, I think that's really, you can really see it in the applications that we get. It's like for food sovereignty, this year we got, I think, $1 million in requests. So it was really tough to have only 300,000. We did raise another 100 from a foundation because I cried to them, and they said, "Oh, let us give you another 100,000." So, so we were able to grant out 400,000, but we could easily grant out $1 million or probably more a year, because word is getting out that we're a funder. And, you know, we've got some good resources from Seattle mostly. And so folks across the region are really starting to learn more about us, and we're getting lots and lots of requests. So that means we got to get busy and raise more money.
Susan, we've got a question here from Rob in the audience. He says, thank you for sharing the great work that you're doing. in addition to providing material support, how can non-Indigenous people support the work you're doing in Discovery Park and Daybreak Star in particular?
Oh, that is a good question. I do think we have a call out for volunteers. Occasionally they have big work days. And so look on our website for those, and get on our mailing list. We did have one recently this spring, and they planted 4,000 native plants. And so with our funding from King Conservation District and from the city of Seattle, we've been able to do a lot of that work, and we do need volunteers because that's a lot of native plants. So our goal is to get a food forest going out there, and yeah, so stay tuned for that. That's one way I can think of for sure. Yeah, I really would like to get somebody, a staff person, to focus on volunteer opportunities, because I know we should have more, but as a pretty small nonprofit, it's hard to, dot all those I's and cross all those T's. But we would like to provide more volunteer opportunities, and hopefully in the future we can do that. Or potentially let folks know about some of the things that our partner organizations are doing. Like the Chief Seattle Club has 4 new housing complexes to house Indigenous homeless folks. And our managing director just went over there as program director and is designing amazing programs in all of their housing projects. So we are so proud of her. And so they're going to need volunteers as well. But yeah, I would say sign up for our newsletter, and you can do that on our website, because we put out pretty good communications, I think, and really good. We have a huge social media reach. It's very large, and so we, if you sign up with us, we also share opportunities from our partner orgs.
That's great. And I will share a link to your site out in the follow-up email that I send out to everybody too.
Okay, thanks, Jessica.
Yeah. A couple more questions have come in. If anybody on the panel has a burning question, feel free to interrupt me, but I'm going to go with the audience for now. From Aaron, it says, "Hi, Susan. I want to thank you for your work and for Na'ilahi Fund. Are you working with any other organizations to further the rights of nature efforts? And who are you finding to be good collaborators on this topic?"
Mm-hmm. Well, we just started this work, and our partner is National Org Movement Rights, and that is Casey Camp Hornick from the Ponca Nation, Penny Opal Plant, who is in the Minneapolis area, just relocated from Oakland, where she was for many, many years. She's an activist, environmental justice activist, spokeswoman. And Shannon Biggs, who I've known for many years. When I worked in San Francisco, she was at the International Forum on Globalization. Brilliant, brilliant woman. So that's our primary contact right now. Many, many more will come as we get into this work through the work of movement rights. So their approach is to really help embed the rights of nature into the community and make it like a cultural process, and make sure that community has buy-in, everybody understands what it is. That is the process they do, and they get the community along in their plan, and then they bring in the lawyers and begin to do the code. And so I know there's some groups up here that we will talk with, and hopefully get some more collaboration with our cohort. I know this is the very beginning, and it's going to grow, because this is a big movement, very important. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. This is a question maybe for a few others in the group as well. Wondering, this is from Twee in the audience. Is there a plant salvaging program at the Arboretum for culturally significant plants that need to be removed, for example, as a safety hazard? Could they be harvested and used by native or local communities? Is it feasible for gardens to do this to reduce plant waste?
I can maybe tackle that one. I think that's a great idea, actually. And this is something that I've been thinking about too for the Arboretum, particularly as we think about the Washtenaw Peninsula. So when the 520 project is completed, that peninsula of 28 acres will return to the Arboretum and become a new public green space, which I think is absolutely historic. I mean, it's 28 acres of green space in the middle of the heart of our city, designed for public use. And of course, right now it's a construction site. It's a bit of a blank slate. And so I've been thinking a lot about what, how we would approach, how we should be approaching our plans for that land, and making sure that we're centering those on the needs of our communities and of the original inhabitants of that land. And really making sure that we're just being very intentional that we're meeting the needs of all the communities of Seattle. And so one of the thoughts that I had was around a garden space for this purpose, right? That was native plants, that was a teaching garden, so that people could learn about those plants and what they mean as well. And so I think this thread is something that will certainly be a topic of conversation, continued conversation at the Arboretum. And I love that idea, Tui.
Yeah, I love that. King County had that, and I don't know which department it was through, but we went out and harvested native plants in development sites. Like one was out in Issaquah where they were building a hospital. And we got to go in and harvest a lot of native plants. It was a really cool project. Yeah. Mhm.
Tui says, thank you. So, Susan, I was curious, we're one of our programs that we put on at UW Botanic Gardens is the Urban Forest Symposium. It happens every year, and we're working on the upcoming program for this fall. We have tribal representatives and or indigenous community members in our planning committee, and we have some tribal funding for the program this year. And we really want to look at indigenous communities, our Coast Salish peoples, and how they, what they want to need, how the urban forest serves them, how they want to engage with our forests in our urban areas. And when you're talking about access, that's something that's come up quite a bit. And I just thought it was really interesting to hear about the policy challenge, right? With what you're doing to gather plants being against the formal policy, but not necessarily wanting the department to change the formal policy, because then it opens it up to anybody and everybody. So an interesting thing to navigate, and I know there's not an easy solution, but I wonder if you've got any other thoughts about that. Particularly kind of, a lot of our gardens have space that's also part of that urban forest, and how we can provide access in a way that's meaningful and effective and doesn't kind of open up cans of worms.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a bit of a tough one, Jessica, because we've had challenges with public lands. Well, everybody has the problem of theft, right? And people think, oh, is this for me? Oh, are these salmon berries? Oh, yes. And it's the commons. So, it's our public land. So, you're going to expect some of that. And we like to share with the animals as well, right? So animals and other humans, and that's just part of being in public spaces. But I don't know really how, I mean, frankly, that's one of the reasons we're starting our land trust, is so we can have our land, and we can have some space where we're not going to share. We have our common areas where we share, and we know we share, and we all are generous with each other. But there's, when we talk about regeneration, we need some alone space. We need some space of our own where we can bring back our relatives and celebrate them, and not have to worry about pesticides or folks stealing them, or and we can have our teaching spaces together, and so I think there's room for all of it. There's room for all of it. But some of the things we're doing with public lands is signage in the Lushootseed language, to educate everybody about the Indigenous presence here. So we've done that at the Daybreak Star Ethnobotanical Garden there. We had a project years ago funded by the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods. And Joyce Mastenbrook, who was the person that built that garden, when she was, I think that was she was doing that in her PhD work. And then we took it over when she went on to other things, kind of the maintenance of that. And we need to get back there. Somebody needs to get back there. It needs a little help. But, I think there's room for all of it, right? There's room for all of it. So, but I just want us to think really intentionally about public spaces and how the inclusion of Indigenous thought and knowledge and life ways enriches everybody. And so I think that is why we need to include Indigenous people in the planning. And we did give a grant to the University of Washington First Nations Student Club for their gardens there at UW. And the tribe that we've been working most closely with recently is Suquamish. They have a lovely traditional plants and medicine person and program out there. And we just started in earnest this past year a survey to the Native community, the larger Native community, survey on what they would like to see in a Native village. And so that's our first project with our Land Conservancy, is that we're visioning together with Native people what it would look like to have a Native village in Seattle. And so stay tuned for more on that one. We are almost finished with the survey phase. We'll write up a report on the findings, and then we'll go into visioning for the project, planning for the project, capital campaign, and all that. So that's super exciting. We're envisioning a village that will have a carving shed, cultural spaces, teaching gardens, greenhouses, small business, artists, maybe a little housing, place for the children. So it's pretty exciting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is super exciting.
Yeah.
Got a couple of comments and a question here from Susan in the audience. She says, I love that defined teaching and harvesting idea talked about at that peninsula in the Arboretum, thinking outside of the box here. But if there were some land areas that were designated rather like pea patches, but with Indigenous native plant focus, that might help educate people. And she's also curious, who else has programs across the country that we might look to model after or emulate? You have any novel or potentially powerful partnerships that might want to point gardens like ours in their direction?
I don't know of any off the top of my head. Our sister organization in California, the Cultural Conservancy, they just had a whole farm donated to them. And so they have teaching spaces out there. They grow a lot of food. They bring in students. So it's a teaching farm, and it's a production farm. In terms of gardens with Indigenous, I just don't know. I could put my feelers out though and probably get some good information in. There's a lot at the Denver Botanical Garden, and maybe Mei Lin can talk about that a little bit, the native plants and things there.
It's an incredible place. And I have to also just be really honest and transparent. I've been there for 6 months. And I am still learning every day. But I tell you, I think what, we're really trying to shift in the organization is really truly partnering with various organizations that are out there to elevate and support Indigenous, but also BIPOC communities. And so we're actively doing that. And I think that there's so much more opportunity, and which this kind of brings me back to a thought that I think with one of the first or a couple questions, it comes to me, when I think about public gardens, I also think about what is the message that we're sending. And often we tote this really complex, I think, line with, we are showcasing, the wonderful diversity that we have in gardens, but it's almost to a sterile point where we don't allow people to actually touch or smell or walk amongst. But we know that, we have to keep a certain level of integrity so that other people can enjoy it and it's not torn down every single day, right? But I think that this is something we do need to start to push ourselves a little bit, right? Is starting to understand, are there spaces that we can, or how can we become more relevant to more than just those that are seeking pleasure and a place of just of beauty, as significant as that is, and uplifting as that is that only still addresses, I think, one part. And so if we are fueling the belief of, here's this walled off space and this is what you do here and this is what you experience here, but you don't do that anywhere else. and it actually changed, that affects how people look at nature, especially if you're in urban environments, right? And so people are going out to nature, which is usually far away. You have to drive to, and not all people can get there to immerse themselves in kind of this natural space. And yet there are still all these rules. So I think we just have to be very honest about the messages that we're sending, right? And it's not just in our interpretation, but it is literally in how can we be really relevant to the different needs in our community. And I do believe that comes to food sovereignty, right? And food security. And I do think that has to do with Indigenous land use and space, right? For ritual, for harvesting medicines, things like that. So I think this is a space where we can get really creative. And I think we do have to push our boundaries and our comfort zones just a little bit, right? It's probably not the answer that people are looking for, but I can say that this is something we think about. And I think that we're certainly at Denver Botanic Garden, we do a little bit of everything, but we're also always pushing out the edge of innovation and what if. And I think if more gardens did that and started answering that what if, then I think we can really come up with some wonderful initiatives and really change how we think and interact in a natural space.
Hear, hear. I will say there are a couple of local examples that have come up related to the last questions that have come in. There is a native garden that is part of the UW student farm at the Center for Urban Horticulture. Somebody submitted a question asking about doing something along those lines there, and that's actively happening. There was an article in the Seattle Times in the last few weeks that included some discussion of that, and so I will find that link and include that also in the email to send out to everyone. And it sounds that Heronswood, which is a garden out on the Kitsap Peninsula, is also working on a new section devoted to Native and Indigenous plants and their uses. So good opportunities for further education.
I thought of one while Maylin was speaking, is Portland. They have got some great projects happening in Portland around a dear friend of mine and professor at Portland State, Judy Bluehorse, and she's been leading some really cool projects there as well. on public lands as well.
Yeah, I loved in that one question too about the Center for Urban Horticulture and this, one of the things we have a lot of out there is space. And I love the idea of an ethnobotanical garden there. I think that there's a huge opportunity for that. It's, something that I've had in mind for a long time. I think the native garden is a great start to that, but there's so much more we could do, right? So much more we could do.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight one of the points that Maylin made, that let's think differently about these spaces. One of the things that we know about indigenous interaction with the land and the plants is that where we go, plants flourish. When you harvest plants, you thin them, you care for them, you have human interaction with them, they do better. And I've seen it with my own eyes. I've harvested tule along the Sacramento River with the tule lady, and that was a lot of fun. Boy, you get really muddy feet though. You get really wet, muddy feet because you really get into it and harvest them. But she took us to places where she harvests, and then she took us to places where had no human interaction, and it's profoundly different. And we've seen it with camas. We've seen it with a lot of our, so, we might rethink gardens, make them a little bit bigger, have some places where people can actually harvest. What a concept, huh?
More of an interactive kind of experience than a don't touch, this is a museum kind of experience, and invite in more participation. I love that so much.
Yeah.
And it reminds me too of some of the recent conversations that I've been a part of at the School for the Environment and Forest Sciences around wildfire management and the management of public lands writ large, and just how when we actually actively engage with these ecosystems and we actively manage them, that the wildfire risk is lower, that like we, so much of the danger that we face today is a result of, this kind of colonial, approach to interactions with the land. And so it's a one, I think that's a great concept and something to think about bringing into the public garden space. Absolutely.
And I think that there's just something else, right, to that point right there, which is that we humans are a part of the natural system. And when we enforce behavior that says you can't do this, it's still enforcing the belief that we are separate. And so I love what you were saying, Susan, about humans interacting in a space, we are part of it and we have influence. And so this is perhaps like another way to think about it and to push ourselves. And how do we create more of those opportunities? And that becomes the message, right? Because I think that this is the struggle that public gardens face almost existentially, is that we do believe in diversity and we love it and we celebrate it and we want to promote that stewardship, yet our organizational structures and the legacy of colonialism and those beliefs are really enforcing then this separation. And so there's this tension, and then we go, but why don't more people want to explore? And we know that this is open for everybody, so why aren't they experiencing it? And it has to do, I think, a lot of times with the message we're sending. We're still enforcing that they're separate.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Maylin. And I do think about the opportunities as you reimagine the public spaces and start deliberately designing and inviting in different communities. Not only do you become relevant to all communities, but I think you have such an enriching opportunity for learning and conversation that right now we don't have, though a lot of great spaces. There's some, but I think that a public garden could really transform its mission to be that space of learning and interaction and coming together through plants, frankly, which are some of the life-giving for humans. So I think it's a phenomenal opportunity, but it takes a bold step, and it takes people being able to embrace some pretty dramatic changes in public spaces.
Yeah, and I think I think a perfect segue into then the other aspect that is the elephant in the room that I don't think we realize is the elephant, is that as public gardens and as institutions that were built on from university on that kind of systemic, very much colonized hierarchy structures and power in our gardens, as we are seeking to be places for all. A lot of times I think in some of our thinking, we're really approaching things in a very tactical way, and I totally understand and relate to that, but it's still where we're reaching out to the Black community or the Latino, Latinx community or the Asian American or the Native Indigenous, but we're still saying, but come into this white space and assimilate. We are asking people to assimilate and still fit into this white world that we have created and the dominance of that system, instead of really thinking differently about our purpose and who we are and how we do things. And that is in a systemic way. We look at our policies, our procedures, our boards, how we structure things. And so I think that that's just like a big click that hit me recently through conversations and through this cohort program and the learning that opportunities we have. It's really shining a light on that. And I think that that is something we just have to be very aware of in our initiatives as we move forward in our partnerships. It's not about assimilation.
Thank you. That's a great conversation. And if anyone else would like to add any closing comments, I'm happy to open the floor for that, but we are a little bit past time, so I want to call attention to that too. All right, seeing no microphones unmuting, I will go ahead and start to wrap things up. I do have a closing slide here. I think when this webinar ends, a survey will pop up on your web browser that will ask what more you'd like to hear about in this series and future conversations. And also we invite folks to come and participate in a workshop that we're going to do, a town hall style type workshop at the end of this series, to really talk about how we can start putting some of these ideas into action and creating real action on the ground. So it's not just talk. Appreciate everyone's time so much. Susan, thank you for being our special guest this evening. And we hope to continue these conversations with all of you. So take care and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you all. And thanks, Susan, for joining us. It was fantastic.